You walk into an exam room, and within about 30 seconds, you already know where the visit is going. You've seen this problem thousands of times. The diagnosis is familiar, the treatment is familiar, the follow up is familiar. 10 years ago, that kind of competence felt exciting. Now, it mostly feels routine. Nothing is wrong. The clinic runs, the schedule stays full, and patients keep coming. But at some point, another question starts showing up. If this is what being good at medicine feels like, what happens next? Because medicine gives us a very clear story about the first half of our careers. You train, you accumulate skill, you work long hours learning how to solve difficult problems, and eventually you become very good at something that most people can't do. Their early years are about improvement. You're getting faster, more confident, more capable. There's always another level to reach. But somewhere along the way, that changes. Competence stops being the challenge. You already know how to do the work, and the questions start shifting. Not the clinical questions, the personal ones. How long do I want to keep working like this? What does the next phase of a career actually look like? Medicine doesn't spend much time talking about that part, but it's a transition many physicians eventually run into. And it's something I started thinking about years ago when I came across a book by Arthur Brooks called From Strength to Strength. Well, hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Better Physician Life podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. So, I want to try something a little different for the next few episodes. From time to time, physicians I work with ask if there are books that helped me think about physician life differently. Not medical textbooks, more books about work, careers, and some of the questions that eventually show up once we've been in medicine for a while, but that we don't really talk about with each other. Questions about work, direction, money, and what the next phase of a career is supposed to look like. Questions that medicine never really trained us to think about. So, over the next few episodes, I thought it might be interesting to talk through a few of those books here on the podcast. Not as book reviews, more as a way to explore ideas that medicine itself doesn't spend much time talking about. And one of the books that really stuck with me is a book by Arthur C. Brooks called From Strength to Strength. Because the central idea in that book touches something a lot of physicians eventually run into. The idea that the abilities that help you succeed early in life are not necessarily the same abilities that define the second half of life. And if you don't recognize that shift when it starts happening, it can feel like something is going wrong. And if you think about the way most physicians build a career, this makes a lot of sense. The early years of medicine reward a very specific kind of ability: speed, pattern recognition, technical skill. The ability to walk into a room, hear a few pieces of the story, and already have a short list of diagnoses in your head. Seeing a lab value or imaging result and immediately recognizing the pattern. Performing procedures that require coordination, timing, and precision. Brooks talks about this as fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is what medicine rewards heavily in the early years. Residency is basically years of practicing this ability under pressure. You're making decisions quickly, often with incomplete information, and often while completely exhausted. And early in our medical careers, those abilities keep improving. You get faster, more efficient, more confident in your judgment. You start recognizing patterns younger physicians haven't seen yet. A patient starts describing their symptoms, and halfway through the sentence, you already know where the visit is going. That kind of competence is deeply satisfying. But Brooks points out something that many high performers don't spend much time thinking about. Fluid intelligence naturally peaks early in life. And if a lot of how you see yourself is tied to being the person who is fast, sharp, technically excellent, even the idea of that curve changing can feel very uncomfortable. Because medicine trains us to believe that our value comes from being the person who can solve the problem, the one who can see the diagnosis first, the one who can figure it out quickly. That's the role we spend decades building. And for a long time, that's exactly what the system rewards. But Brooks points out that this isn't the whole story. Because while fluid intelligence gradually declines, another form of intelligence tends to grow. He calls it crystallized intelligence. This is a different kind of capability, less about speed, more about judgment, less about processing information quickly, more about recognizing deeper patterns over time. It's the kind of thinking that develops after you've seen thousands of patients, after you've watched how certain diagnoses unfold over years, after you've seen what happens to patients 5 or 10 years after a treatment decision, after you've watched careers rise, stall, and change direction. Crystallized intelligence is perspective. It's the ability to step back and see the bigger picture. And interestingly, many physicians eventually notice that some of the parts of medicine that became more meaningful later in a career rely on this kind of thinking. Helping a younger physician work through a complicated case, advising someone who's struggling with a career decision, recognizing the dynamic in a patient situation that isn't obvious on the surface. Those moments rely less on speed and more on experience. And that's a different way of being useful. But there's a transition that has to happen for that shift to feel natural. And that transition can feel strange. Because for most of our lives, the goal in medicine was pretty simple: achieve, improve, advance, train, boards, first attending job, then maybe some productivity targets, RVUs, leadership roles, financial milestones. The career moves forward through achievement. And achievement feels good, at least for a while. Because for most of our lives, the milestones in medicine are pretty clear. You get into medical school, you finish residency, you pass your boards, you land your first attending job. And each step feels significant when it happens. You work for years to get there. You remember where you were when you matched. You remember the first day you sat in the attending physician's lounge. Those moments matter. But Brooks describes something he calls the striver's curse. The idea that for people who spend their lives pursuing achievement, satisfaction often turns out to be pretty short-lived. You reach the milestone, you feel good for a little while, and then the target moves. Sound familiar? Yeah, me too. In medicine, that can show up in a lot of familiar ways. Early in practice, the goal might be paying off student loans. Then it's building the retirement accounts. Then maybe hitting a certain income level or partnership or a leadership role, or finally getting the call schedule to something more manageable. Each milestone promises a feeling of having arrived. But for many high achievers, the sense of arrival doesn't last very long because our minds quickly start looking for the next target, another benchmark, another number, another step forward. And over time, it can start to feel a little like a never-ending treadmill. You're still moving, you're still accomplishing things, but the feeling of having arrived tends to be very brief. Brooks has an interesting way of explaining why this happens. He says satisfaction isn't simply a matter of getting more. It's more like a fraction. What you have divided by what you want. And for people who spend their lives achieving things, that denominator has a way of growing. You reach one goal, and before long, the next one takes its place, which means the definition of enough also keeps changing. And when enough keeps moving, the feeling of having arrived doesn't last very long. There's another pattern Brooks points out that shows up in a lot of high achieving professions, including medicine. Some of the most accomplished careers are also some of the most isolating. Doctors, lawyers, people whose work carries a lot of responsibility and long hours. Part of the reason is structural. The training is long, the schedules are demanding, and over time, a lot of life ends up organized around work. Colleagues become the people you spend the most time with, sometimes more time than anyone else in your life. And Brooks makes a distinction that I think is worth thinking about. The difference between deal friends and real friends. Deal friends are people connected to your work. People you know because you share patients, or a clinic schedule, or a call rotation. Real friends are different. They know your life, not just your job. And as careers get busier, many high achievers slowly accumulate more deal friends and a lot fewer real friends. Now, to be clear, this isn't really about being alone. A lot of physicians actually enjoy alone time. After a long clinic day or a weekend on call, quiet can feel pretty good. Brooks makes a helpful distinction here: the difference between solitude and loneliness. Solitude is the experience of being alone by choice. It's restorative. It's the quiet moments after a long day. Loneliness is different. Loneliness is the feeling of being disconnected, of not having people who really know your life. And those two experiences are easy to confuse, because someone can have plenty of colleagues, plenty of professional relationships, and still feel surprisingly alone. Because medicine asks a lot of us. The training is long, the hours can be unpredictable, and the responsibility is real. For years, most of our energy goes toward becoming competent, learning the medicine, taking care of patients, keeping the system moving. And during those years, it's easy for the rest of life to narrow a little. Time and attention are limited, and work takes priority. In a lot of ways, that makes sense. Patients need you to be focused. Colleagues depend on you. The system depends on you showing up prepared. But over time, some physicians begin to notice something. They spent decades becoming excellent at the work, but they didn't spend nearly as much time building the parts of life outside work: relationships, community, interests that have nothing to do with medicine. None of that feels urgent when you're 28 or 32 or maybe even 35. The career itself feels like the main project. But as the years pass, the questions start to change. Questions about how long you want to keep working the way you're working. Questions about what the next phase of a career might look like. Questions about what life looks like outside the exam room. And this is another place where Brooks' book is very helpful, because he argues that many high achievers eventually reach a point where life begins to move from one curve to another. The first curve is about achievement, building skill, building reputation, becoming excellent at something that is very difficult. But the second curve is different. Less about proving what you can do, more about how you want to spend the time you have. And so Brooks introduces another idea that I think many physicians eventually recognize: the idea of liminality. Liminality is the period where the role you've been playing for years starts to shift, but the next version of you isn't fully clear yet. Our medical careers actually have a bunch of these transitions built in. The shift from medical student to resident, the shift from resident to attending, the shift from early career physician to the person others start coming to for advice. Each of those transitions involves letting go of something that once defined you. And that can be very uncomfortable because the role you spent years mastering starts to change. For a long time, the job was clear: learn more, work harder, become excellent, prove you can do the work. But eventually, the questions become a little different. Not just what can I achieve next, but how do I want the next phase of my life to look? And that's not a question medicine spends much time preparing us for, because the training system is built around the first curve: competence, performance, responsibility. But the second curve often asks different things: perspective, mentorship, relationships, time. Brooks has a concept in the book that I thought was really powerful. He describes a falling tide. When the tide goes out, it stirs up food in the water and fish start biting. And he says that when that happens, there's really only one mistake you can make: not having a line in the water. In other words, when circumstances start to change, the important thing is to stay curious about what might come next. Try things, explore new directions. Don't assume that the next phase of life has to look exactly like the last one. And for physicians, that exploration doesn't have to mean leaving medicine. Most of the time, it simply means recognizing that the role can evolve. You may still see patients, but maybe you also mentor younger physicians, or take on teaching, or become more intentional about how much of your time belongs to medicine and how much belongs to the rest of your life. Because at some point, the question stops being whether you can do the work. You already know you can. The question becomes how you want the work to fit into the life you're already building. And that's a conversation many physicians eventually start having with themselves. Sometimes it's also a conversation that's easier to think through with someone outside your immediate circle. If you find yourself thinking about some of these questions around work, career, direction, or what the next phase of your career might look like, and you'd like someone to think it through with, you can learn more about physician coaching at betterphysicianlife.com. Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to check out From Strength to Strength by Arthur C. Brooks, and I'll see you next time on the Better Physician Life podcast.